Again, welcome everyone. I am Grattan Brown, the Academic Dean of Thales College. And we're really excited to talk about our classical education leadership major and to hear from Dr. Jonathan Yonan. Well, the classical education movement has been going now for, let's say, 2,500 years, since Thales of Miletus predicted an eclipse and cornered the market on olive oil and urged us all, know thyself. And closer to our own time, of course, during the 20th century, the classical education movement picked up steam, ironically and in a way sadly, at the time when classical education was diminishing in our society. I'm sure most of us, if not all of us, remember Dorothy Sayers' famous article penned about the middle of the 20th century, lamenting people's inability to learn and to think precisely when society needed it most. And, today we're all too familiar with the dangers of living in a society filled with powerful technology and little wisdom about humanity. But we also know the possibilities of a society filled with technology guided by a wise understanding of humanity. And so we need classical education. We're really excited to launch a BA in classical education and leadership. We're looking for young people who love classical education and who have a gift for teaching, and who recognize the need for leadership at all the different levels of classical education in schools, in homeschool groups, all across the board. They're going to learn not only a classical approach to the humanities, but also a classical approach to math and to science. And working on this program really impressed upon me the challenge to the classical education movement of connecting calculus and connecting modern science back to the classical tradition. Not only do we want to educate people, young people who love the classical tradition and who love math and who love science and who want to teach it in classical schools, but we want to help this movement make progress on reconnecting math and science to the classical tradition, and also helping students learn math and science at its highest levels so that they can teach it in classical schools. With us is Dr. Jonathan Yonan, who's been a guiding light in helping us at Thales College to develop this major. Dr. Yonan is an independent scholar, a leader in the classical school movement. He led St. David's School in Raleigh, North Carolina. He's been a leader in K through 12 and in higher education in a Great Books College in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And if you haven't already Googled him, you're probably going to, but don't do it yet. When you do, you'll find some videos of Jonathan Yonan speaking about human dignity. But now we're going to hear him talk about classical education and the new major that we're launching. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Yonan. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Dean Brown. It's great to be here. We always have to do this these days. You can hear me, right?
Yes, I can.
We're all good. So here I am beaming in. We're connecting over phenomenal new technology. And it's a state-of-the-art situation where you can't see us right now in office environments, but you know that there's lighting around us and there's technology. There's a bustling world out there, and yet and as we all know, so much has changed over the last 2,500, 3,000 years, and yet certain things remain the same. The most important things remain the same. And so I want to start with a simple observation as I walk you through what we're trying to do with this program. Two people start at the beginning of a race or of a walk, a long walk. Two people are imperceptibly aimed in different directions. One is just a fraction turned to the left, and another is is turned just a fraction to the right. But standing there looking at them to all the watching world, they look like they're just shoulder to shoulder in exactly the same position. None of us can see the microscopic differences in their aim or their trajectory or their target. And then we begin to watch them walk, each in a straight line, each pursuing the direction that they are imperceptibly, though inevitably, aimed. And over time, after 100 yards or 200 yards, it becomes apparent that they're somewhat slightly aimed in different directions. But as they pursue their aim further and further, after a mile, after 10 miles, after 10 years, after a lifetime, what we find is that they're aimed in radically different directions and they've arrived at completely different destinations. And so it's always important to realize that we must begin with our end in view. This is not my insight. It's a long and old and ancient insight. And yet it's one that we always have to be watchful about. This is true about our own lives. It's true about the lives of ourselves as students or as parents. It's true about the lives of our students someday when we teach, and also about institutions, even about societies. So we must recognize that it's worth stopping and taking stock and setting our aim well when we set out on a journey. And that's what human life is. It's a journey. A journey is a short adventure that you might take for 4 years as a college student. A life is a journey. A nation is an experiment in liberty, a journey. In fact, a whole civilization can be a journey. And so that's what we're beginning with in recognition of that truth. Each student that takes this major, each future student who sits under one of our graduates as a pupil of one of these graduating teachers is on a journey. And certainly all of the schools and the whole vision of classical education is on a journey. And so we really must step back, ask where we're heading, and what's the best way to get there. And that itself is a classical insight. It's a classical insight in the sense that we are going to step back and ask ourselves about truths that are fundamental, questions that some have said are permanent questions, the questions that can't be changed. No matter what revolution, no matter what political ideology, these are the questions that we're stuck with, even if we try to be blind to them. Questions like, what does it mean to live a good life? Why is there evil in the world? What is a good society? What does it mean to flourish or to be happy? We can't avoid these questions, and we can't just simply superimpose our hopes on these questions without having to do serious business with what they mean and what they are. In fact, I think that contemporary education, the contemporary state education and the contemporary independent school educational system, and even universities and colleges have forgotten this basic insight that there are certain questions that we must always deal with. And there's a long history of how those questions should be puzzled through. And we can't just superimpose our own ideology on top of them. Classical education begins with this basic humility, which goes all the way back to people like Thales and Socrates, or the psalmist in the Hebrew Bible. The basic humility that says, I don't know, and I'm going to sit in humility at the feet of people who have lots of experience and lived through this, not just in the last decade, but over the course of centuries and millennia, that I might learn their wisdom, apply it into my own life, and attempt to step into the future with the wisdom that they have, even though the future is new and it's different. So today's contemporary education model, I would argue, has abandoned several key elements of what education has always been and what it ought to be. We've largely abandoned a culture of inquiry in favor of a culture of indoctrination. Now, people in the broad educational discussion would have criticized religious schools as being places where indoctrination has happened. And the state schools, public schools, and independent schools were meant to be the place where you could not have indoctrination. But whatever the validity of that critique is, either way, contemporary schools and contemporary education have begun to prioritize ideology, ensuring that students believe the right things according to public school educators or according to elites, and have forgotten how to promote the idea of learning how to inquire. And what we're all familiar with the phrase learning how to think and not just what to think. And this is a nice cliche, but the reason it's so important is we can't always trust what people tell us. Many times we can, but you can go back just a little while in history to find moments in time where the official authorities were telling the public certain things, and those things weren't true, or they weren't good. And if you believed them or followed them, you might be vulnerable to doing evil things. We can think even in the early 20th century about moments like that. And so to have a person who is actually formed in their heart and in their mind to think for themselves and to think well with a culture of inquiry, the free exchange of ideas, that's so critical. We must always have that. But that's not only about resisting potential moments of tyranny, it's also what's necessary for discoveries in science, for discoveries in physics or chemistry or biology. You think about the great scientists, these are people who had to live in a moment, hear all the noise of that moment, all the assumptions, and still somehow ask a new question, even if there were headwinds telling them not to. A culture of inquiry, a culture of the free exchange of ideas. Now, this isn't a new idea. This has been with us from the very beginning. Socrates was very good at asking questions. Jesus in the Gospels is constantly asking questions. The art of asking a good question is the beginning of any good education. And most people don't realize it's not the people with the best answers that are the smartest or the wisest or the most well-equipped. It's usually the people with the best questions. Because a pretty good question is a lot better than a poor answer. So one of the things that this program, being a classical program, is going to prioritize is the art of learning how to ask questions with your future students so that they become well-equipped, lifelong learners capable of facing whatever adventures come their way. And we can know that technology, economics, science, bioethics are going to continue to throw curveballs at us, things that we couldn't anticipate, but we need to be prepared for, not because we have all the information, but because we know how to ask fresh questions that prepare us to deal with those things. If only some of our leaders today knew how to think well with new, fresh questions. So that's an environmental situation that I see in our culture today. And Thales has a terrific opportunity in front of it. As you know, Thales College is a really special organization, and it has a vision to bring forward into the current moment with all of its technology and its economic realities, the classical vision of learning. And it's a wonderful thing. There's a lot of classical programs out there that are attempting to get us in 2021 to go back 200 years or go back 3,000 years to a former time. What Thales is trying to do, I think, is to take the wisdom of the ages and bring it into the 21st century so that we can live it well today. That's really important. And I think the opportunity is profound. In fact, I just was rereading how one commentator who was looking at the Greek financial crisis in 2010 watched the men and women in the street who were protesting. He said, they're not protesting something financial, they're protesting reality. The idea that as we face new challenges in the future, we're able to carry forward the wisdom of the ages and know what reality really is, allows us to be ready and prepared for those kinds of things. So I want to talk a little bit about this program now. I have a little bit of time left. The program that we're talking about combines an emphasis on leadership and an emphasis on education. When you are considering a bachelor's degree in education in the United States in 2021, you're usually looking at education programs that are curated by the Department of Education and are preparing you for certification into a public school system. And those programs, those education programs, are largely carriers of ideologies that none of us are really intentionally involved with. We're not really jumping in because of the ideologies. We're jumping in because we want the job or the certification or the preparation for the degree and for the job. But the ideologies that are being carried in through those programs are still there. And a lot of teachers who start teaching in public schools never realize that there are all sorts of things that have been taught that you could call into question. You could ask good questions about. And so Thales is offering an alternative to the standard education programs that are out there. And I want to argue, having worked in a university environment, having worked in a school environment, that there is so much waste in the use of students' time in college education majors, tons of waste. And there is so much that is not useful for actually teaching in the classroom. And Thales has wrung out all of that content, all that waste, and is attempting to be really honorable of the time and a good steward of the time that the student is able to bring to college. And the program is very practical. It's going to bring in some of the wisdom of educational theorists. How do you teach? How do you run a classroom? How do you grade? How do you set assignments? How do you design a large curriculum? How do you run a school? So it's very practical. It's also historical. It doesn't look at the moment that we're in as the summit of all wisdom. It looks back and it recognizes wisdom from the past. People have already been mentioned, Charlotte Mason, and Thales, and Socrates, and many, many others. So it's very historical. It's also theoretical. It's going to require that a student who is a future teacher is able to articulate a philosophy of education, not just some nice ideas about education, which is what many people mean by a philosophy of education, but a whole and complete vision of what education is for the student, for the teacher, and for an institution, a school. And so the program will require courses in classical schooling, which is how do you think about the whole organization of a school and how to run a school, but also how do you think about classical pedagogy? How do you run a classroom? It's going to teach teachers how to write, teach teachers how to run laboratory experiments. It's going to teach teachers how to grade. And so the program is very, very practical and looking at all levels of education, all the elements of a K-12 education. But it's also very classical. And some people will have studied other classical education programs that are out there, other perhaps bachelor's degrees that are designed to prepare future teachers in classical schools. And what I just want to say is, as of right now, there's a bottleneck in the classical education world. There is a vast need in schools for excellent teachers to teach in classical schools. And there is a profound need in our society for more classical schools who are raising up future citizens who are well equipped as leaders and citizens in society. And so we need lots of classical education, but most of the classical education talk today is about making sure people have read lots of good books, but not making sure that they know how to run an effective classroom, how to run an effective school, how to teach the practical things that make a school or classroom excellent. And so this program is a specific answer to that challenge. And the attempt, the vision, the goal is that the future classical educators of the United States will have come through Thales College or colleges that learn and participate and are in dialogue with Thales, so that we can start to populate schools more and more, not just with people who believe in classical education, but know the difference that it means to do something classically. And let me just finish with what I think the difference is. To do something classically is to recognize that there is an underlying truth that we need to discover, and then we need to order our lives and our institutions in relation to. That even if I wish it were otherwise, it's not. And that what we need to do is to learn that truth and then submit to that reality and do the best we can with that reality. So here's a really good example of that. The earliest stages of education require developing core habits. For example, the habit of attention. No matter what we want to say about a human being, if we haven't actually spent time developing attention in a child, the child will have a very difficult time, arguably an impossible time, attending or paying attention to what they're being taught later on. This is an elementary point, but we, as parents and as educators, have forgotten it. We're constantly surrounded by distractions, and our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And so it becomes harder and harder for students to succeed. And that observation is only proven true as we look at the social science on children's performance. So one simple observation is that way back with people like Aristotle and the psalmist and many of the ancients, the observation that the habit of attention is one of the core elements of a good education, way back with them, this was true. And we've known this as a society, as a civilization for a long time. And we need to remember it and make sure that we prioritize that. So for example, we prioritize sitting down with a book and reading. It's not just about learning how to read. It's about stretching out and elongating the skill, the habit of attention. And in 2021, I'd argue that many educators have forgotten how that simple, fundamental habit opens up the doors of education. And if this is true with a simple thing like attention spans, it's true of many other things, like how to have a seminar discussion, how to think creatively when you're facing a new challenge, how to lead in an organization when you're facing a question that you've never dealt with before. So we could go on, and I could go on trying to walk you through some of the examples of the enduring truths that have been forgotten that classical education seeks to recover, not to take us back in time, but to bring forward the wisdom into our own time so that we're better equipped at facing the challenges of today and tomorrow.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Yonan. I do have a couple of questions for you. And one of them already in the Q&A box. There's also a chat box. Please drop questions in one or the other, and we'll ask them of Dr. Yonan. But I'll take the first question. Dr. Yonan, I'd like to have your thoughts on how do you create a sense of community in a school? In other words, a sense that the teachers and the students form a kind of community, seeking the truth, loving it in order to live it, but in a practical way. Because you've talked about, not only thinking about what to teach, but not only how to teach, but what's the school? What's the role of the family in the school? How does the role of the teacher with relation to the student? And it seems to me that underlying those questions in part is the desire to form a sense of community in a real organization, a real existing organization. So could you share some thoughts about that?
Right, absolutely. The word college actually is our word that was meant to capture this idea. A collegium is a place where people work together to a common purpose. And there's a whole lot of discussion, there's a lot of wisdom on this. But I think the first point that I'd want to make is that a community is formed when people organize together around a common purpose. And we have lots of mission statements in lots of organizations, but in a way, we can't actually change what the mission of a college is or a school. You can say you want a different mission, but the mission of a college or a school is baked into what it is. It's sort of like saying, I can say a chair is this or that, but a chair is a thing you sit on. And a college and a school have a certain purpose. And the purpose has to do with exactly what you just described. The sense that there are certain kinds of developments in human beings that cannot be accomplished by individuals, that we actually must come together and benefit from each other. Because in the case of learning, I can become myopic. I can be blind on one side or on two sides. I can have tunnel vision. I can forget the past. I can have certain kinds of attitudes or behaviors or mindsets that make me less likely to see the comprehensive picture of truth that's there. And so what a school does, or what a college is intended to do, is to put us with others. And this is the best sense of the word diversity, to put us with others who help us see things more completely. They get their eyes on it, I get my eyes on it, and we see things more completely. And we enjoy the adventure of that give and take, that exchange, where we say, isn't it a little bit more like this? Maybe, but it also seems a little bit more like this. And as we do that, as we have that kind of discussion, that dialogue, sometimes it's a debate, we start to see things more completely. And we find that people together are shaping each other into better and better persons towards a common purpose. And so then you have to say, well, what is that ultimate purpose that we have to have in view? And I'd want to say something like, the ultimate purpose is that each person becomes a good person, and that the culture that we work to the culture that we shape together is the sort of culture that allows us to be good people. And so how do we do that? Well, one thing we do is we embrace questions. We must embrace questions. And the teacher we've all sat in classes where the teacher asks a question, a couple of quiet people spit out a possible answer. The teacher says, oh, that's interesting, that's interesting. And then the teacher just ignores the discussion that's possible there, and then jumps right into saying what they wanted to say. And what that classroom is it's really just a lecture with a seminar veneer, a discussion that's a pretend discussion, because the teacher's just using those moments to jump ahead. Now, I don't think there's any malice in that teacher. I don't think there's any bad will in that teacher. I just think that a lot of teachers haven't learned the art of leading a good discussion. And one of the key elements of a good discussion is that a teacher genuinely positions themselves in the room as a learner. Now, they're not going to be a learner such that they don't have anything to offer. They're a learner who's a few steps, a few miles ahead with some insights. But they're not people who have no questions. They're not people who have nothing to learn. And so we're constantly, as teachers in this kind of environment, showing students that we actually are learning things from them. So that's a really good example of a way that we build culture together. And if I'm not going too long here, you can tell I get excited about this. We also acknowledge that the books and the minds that we're studying together in that classroom, that they also have something to offer us, that they are not ours to be mastered and dominated with our theories and our critiques and our better politics, but they are broken, frail and short-sighted human beings with loads of wisdom. And so what we want to do is we want to take a book off the bookshelf, open it up, and recognize that this person on this bookshelf is a real human being who had wisdom. They're probably a lot more wise than we are. And then when I dialogue with them in the classroom, I'm actually learning from them. And I don't have to say that everything was good about them. But I do get to say that their wisdom is something I can benefit from. Now, Aristotle had an observation. He said that he didn't really want students. He says this in his Metaphysics. He didn't really want students who were under the age of 30 to be his students because they didn't have enough experience in life to have the humility to be willing to learn from others. He seemed to think that people who were younger than 30 hadn't gotten kicked around enough yet, so they thought they knew too much. And people who were 30 and older had been kicked around by life enough that they realized that they had something to learn. And then he says that his students would be those who were 30. But there's another guy named Seneca who's from Rome, and he actually said that the antidote for the young is not just to get older, because the 20-year-old has no hope then. They just have to wait until they're 30. Seneca, in a separate work, says, and he's much later than Aristotle, and I'm sure he appreciated Aristotle, but Seneca said that there's 3 ways for the young to get ahead of their age. The first, he says, is that they can read literature or poetry. This is a way of taking imaginary characters who are older than you and wiser than you. They didn't live, they're not historical characters, and adding them on. He uses the word annexing them onto your own life. I don't have to have lived for me to take, or lived to 70 for me to take King Lear's life, annex it onto my own. He didn't live, but I get to annex it onto my own and be a little wiser because of it, so I don't have to make all of his mistakes. He also said you can annex the lives of historical characters. So I don't have to have lived to the age of 70 to benefit from great historical characters. And then the third thing he said is make sure you have mentors, people who are currently alive today that you're able to benefit from their wisdom. And if you actually think about what a classroom is, or what a college is, or what a school is, it's all of those things together. It's the mentor, the teacher, who's not all-knowing, but is still a student, who can play the role of the mentor and add value, add life experience to the student. It's the student and the mentor, the teacher, reading imaginary things like literature and reading things that actually happened, like history and economics and science, and adding them onto the student's life. And when you do that with a spirit of humility, with the common purpose of making each other, you and I, making each other better people, we start to achieve a college, a co-laboring together to form a community. One last anecdote. Petrarch, in his wonderful work, The Ascent of Mount Vertu, acknowledges that he and his brother are climbing a mountain, and they need each other to climb that mountain. The mountain is very, very steep. It's a long, long way up. And each person in his turn gets tired. And each one in his turn needs to encourage the other to continue to climb. Now, I won't tell you what happens in that piece of literature, because you'll read it at Thales College, I'm sure. But it's a wonderful parable for how to go on this journey with someone else or with many other people in such a way that no one gets left behind. And together we all advance all the way up to the summit.
That's good. Let's talk a little more about that give and take, leading to wisdom and charity. And you've talked about it between the teacher and the student in the classroom, preparing the student to take on some of that wisdom before their time, before they're 30. But when they're 30, they'll also be leading, maybe leading a classical school coming out of our program. So I'm going to paraphrase another question from the chat box. Today you have in modern education a concern with methodology and classroom management and all of this technique. To what extent is classical education sort of amenable to that type of thinking? Do we have a classical methodology, or is that something that the classical education movement should say, not really central to education. We should be thinking about other things. How do you situate sort of some of the current practices in education within the classical movement, or do you?
That's a terrific question. That's a really insightful question. And obviously the question behind that is very engaged with the contemporary landscape in education. And so let me just say this. You're gonna find, if you get to know me, you're gonna find that I'm very critical of the contemporary education landscape. And it's become very much subject to purposes and influences that are not for the good of students. So when I make some observations here, please don't hear me giving a fulsome defense of education theory or methodology. But I'm going to say this: there are 2 or 3 really good ways to make an omelet, and there's about 1,000 bad ways to make an omelet. There are 10 or 15 good ways to successfully take off from the ground and fly. And they look very different. You know, a helicopter looks very different than a rocket ship. But there are not unlimited ways to fly. And so there's wisdom in learning some of the core methodological observations, both of the past and some of those that are more recent. Now, what I find is that the best wisdom that we're finding in contemporary methodology or education theory just reinforces observations that we found in the past with social scientific data. So I'll just give a simple example of that. Recently, neuroscientists have observed that neuroplasticity is a real thing, that you can have your mind sort of gets wired a certain way, neural pathways get wired a certain way, and by the time you're about 25, they're kind of set up the way they're going to be. So it's really hard for you to learn how to do something new, like a new foreign language, or even to start making your bed if you haven't learned how to make your bed, if you haven't developed that habit when you were a kid. It's really hard to do that after a certain age. But it is possible, and there is a way to do it. And neuroscience today has been doing a lot of research on the best way to learn how to change brain habits and brain wiring. And they call it neuroplasticity. Well, all the way back in ancient Greece, Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics addresses this problem. He just didn't know contemporary neuroscience. But it turns out that largely what he observed about habit formation in children and in adults has been confirmed by contemporary neuroscience. And so now you're an educator, if you want to teach students good habits, you could learn them from Aristotle, or you could learn them from contemporary neuroscientists, or you could learn them from both and find that there's a confirmation between the two, even though you use ethical language versus neuroscientific language. And then you probably have a little bit of a dialogue. You're going to leave a little bit over here and get rid of that. You're going to leave a little over here and get rid of that. So a lot of times that is the dynamic that's at play in theory, except, and here's a key caveat, except when the theory is actually, when the medium is the message, when the theory is actually smuggling an ideology. And there's a lot of that going on in contemporary education. And so while I think that there are some really good ways to do certain things, I don't think that all the ways are really good. And what I think you're going to find in the Thales College program is that the methodologies that are being taught, and there are methodologies being taught. How do you teach writing? How do you run a science lab in high school? How do you grade? How much homework should you assign? It turns out it's not an unlimited amount. It turns out that if you assign too much homework, you actually get less learning. So how much do you do that? There's some methodological observations that Thales is going to offer you. And it's very, very practical, but it's going to be rooted in the tradition. And it's not going to simply be following contemporary ideological movement. So it's not going to simply be everybody's great. There's no standards. There's no such thing as excellence. We don't just pat everybody on the back. Not every piece of writing is good writing. We're not going to simply take in contemporary ideology, but we are going to benefit from contemporary insights. Especially those insights are going to be interesting when they match with the classical tradition. Now, one thing about leadership, I've led two different organizations. I've led a college and I've led a school. And I will just, it sounds so cliched and so mundane, but it's actually, I think, a very, very deep point. Now, so many people who are in leadership positions have actually never learned how to lead. They've learned how to manage according to a certain textbook, but they've never learned how to lead. And so much of leadership is not simply going with the flow, but it's asking a question when an avalanche of groupthink is coming your way. When the whole group is saying, this is the way you should do something, it's the best way. It's the way that we've been taught. It's what we learned in business school. It's what everybody's saying on Twitter. It's what they're saying on the news. Then you simply, if you just follow that crowd, you're going to do nothing new. You're not going to be a leader. You are, in the end, a follower. And so many people who are at the leadership level of a lot of organizations don't know how to think for themselves, don't know how to ask a fresh question, and don't know how to do something other than follow. And so we need leaders. And I think one of the ways to do that is, one of the ways to develop that, the competence and the courage to lead, is to pay close attention to those people who have done it before, and then to practice it and study it with other aspiring leaders. And it's not just people who say they want to lead. Everybody in our contemporary culture, everybody is a leader. Everybody's learning leadership. But what we need to do is we actually need to study those people who have genuinely led in the face of odds, and then try to internalize that into our own soul. And that actually is as a sidebar, that's a feature of classical education. Classical education isn't just trying to download content into your mind. Classical education recognizes that the best thing we can do is to habituate your soul or your character in a good direction. And so there are loads of people that have theory in their mind about how to lead. But what we want to do at Thales is help you shape a character and a soul and a lifestyle that allows you to step out with courage and then to do real leadership. So there's a few observations, Dean Brown.
Yeah, this is a great point. And our students are going to learn leadership in the liberal arts degree. At Thales College, every student, regardless of their professional major, is going to earn a liberal arts degree and learn leadership, and more importantly, a vision of the human person that is sound and not ideological, by which to make decisions about how rightly to lead, and by which to understand how to draw from this classical tradition in order to counteract and recognize ideologies. So thank you very much for bringing into focus the problem of these ideologies, but also the possibilities of education, of what modern discoveries have added to our understanding of how people learn. Very important. Also, I'm pretty sure that my students are going to quote back to me your line about how it turns out you can't assign an unlimited amount of homework. But I also hope they come back to me with this idea that, a proper understanding of the human person, the good life, is really essential to human flourishing. And if you want to live a good life, you probably ought to figure out how it applies to work as well. What's good work, and how do you work those two together, good life and good work, into a journey of a lifetime. So thank you very much, Dr. Yonan. Your comments have inspired me. I hope they've inspired others to look into our classical education and leadership program, visit our website at www.thalescollege.org and contact us. If you think you're a good fit for Thales College, please contact us. If you think Thales College is not for you, think of somebody who would benefit from what we're offering. Not only a classical education and leadership degree, but also a degree in entrepreneurial business. And beginning in 2023, a BS in mechanical engineering. I'm going to end us here, Dr. Yonan. Thank you again for your kind remarks. And thank you to everybody who's been listening in. And good night, and study well, live a good life.